Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Fidelity Reviewers Training Part 2, which is going to be presented today by Paul Phares. I'm glad that folks are able to attend. We've had a multitude of difficulties with our system, and I really apologize for that. I think the GoToWebinar platform, just like the rest of us, is stressed out about COVID-19 and potentially being overly stressed. So thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for being willing to continue to try and get in and to attend this morning's presentation. I am going to turn it over to Paul, and very honestly, I'm going to work on a problem with GoToWebinar right now. So Paul, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dawn. And you are right. We are all learning all kinds of new things about our resiliency during all of this. So I appreciate you helping fix some of these glitches. I don't know, the attendees might not know, but we've had some glitches within the last several seconds as well. So I'm very thankful for Dawn's help. So welcome, everyone. Today's part 2 of the Fidelity Reviewer training that we started last Wednesday. And just as a reminder, if you weren't on last week, my name is Paul Phares. And so I'm coming to you from Public Consulting Group, and we are working with the state of Washington. The state of Washington has contract with us to help launch Fidelity IPS training in general in the state of Washington, and specifically today, Fidelity Reviewers training. A couple of other hats I wear when I'm not doing this. I'm a director at Community Mental Health Center in Illinois called Robert Young Center, where historically I've been an IPS supervisor. And we have IPS teams here. And then when I'm not wearing that hat, another hat I'm wearing in Illinois is a certified Illinois IPS Fidelity Reviewer. So the state of Illinois hires me to go review other IPS support employment programs throughout the state. I've seen a lot of things. And if you remember from last week, we talked a lot last week about the nuts and bolts of the Fidelity scale. If you missed that session, it is recorded. I can, before the end of today, I can make sure that you know where to find that if you'd like. And then today, we're going to talk really about the process of Fidelity Review from the Fidelity Reviewer's perspective. So that's kind of where we're going to launch today. If you have questions for me, I think we learned last time that both the chat bar and the questions bar, I think people shared with me that they had the most success in the questions bar. So I'm going to try to look. I see some of the audio is very bad. Yeah. Okay.
Paul, excuse me. Paul, excuse me for just a moment. I'm getting a number of comments that the audio is very poor, and it is from my end as well.
Okay, let me see.
Let's
see if I can join my phone. I'll click on my computer. Let me see if I can join my phone instead. So bear with me.
All right. So I'm going to kind of pick up where Paul left off while he's trying to fix his piece of the audio, and just ask if there were questions from the last session. And do please either type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will make the attempt to unmute you. Normally I would say I would just unmute you, but lately it's that I will make the attempt. I suspect you understand.
Dawn, this is Paul. Can you hear me better?
Much, much better. Thank you.
I'm learning.
Improvement.
I'm learning every day. So I'm now back by phone. And I won't say every single thing that I said before. I won't bore you with all of that. Long story short, we're here for part 2 of the Fidelity Reviewers training. My name is Paul Phares. And I've been working with Dawn and others in Washington as part of my work with Public Consulting Group to launch IPS-supported employment in the state of Washington. Just again, quick housekeeping. This is a slide we showed last week. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but really, we're going to take breaks throughout. I know this is usually a face-to-face session that we take all day to do, so I have tried to build in breaks. At your discretion, if you need to get up and move your legs or something, I trust that you will do that. Please silence your phone. one of the delights of this COVID-19 experience is getting on calls and hearing things like train whistles and sirens in the background and dogs barking and kids asking mom or dad for a treat from the refrigerator. So to the degree that we can minimize that, that would be excellent. I will also try to manage the question bar. In your sidebar, you should see either a chat or a question area or both. On the last call, we learned that it was easiest for most of the folks to just type a question in the question box as opposed to the chat. So I'll be monitoring both throughout, and then we will just kind of answer questions as they come up. You don't have to save them till the end. I am going to be using some documents that Dawn emailed out to us before last week's call. So when I transition from our slide deck to a document, I will give you a couple seconds to find the right document, and we'll just kind of go from there. If you were on last week's call, you should be hopefully kind of understanding where we're headed with this. If you were not on last week's call, you might feel a little lost, and that's okay. Ask questions, and I'll try to direct you to the answer to the best that I can. So without any further delay, right, let's kind of get going and see. So today we're talking about Fidelity Reviews and the process behind Fidelity Reviews. And so one of the things we talked about last week that I think is a really important point for you to really understand as a potential Fidelity Reviewer and as an IPS provider is that the IPS supported employment model really is okay, but it's great when there are Fidelity Reviews happening. And what I mean to say by that is, if you have an evidence-based practice, a practice based on research that says it is, high quality, to have a Fidelity Review periodically come in and verify that quality really, I think, puts a bow on the evidence-based part of the evidence-based practice. There are places I've been where providers they claim to be doing IPS and they've never had a Fidelity Review. Some of those places do their own Fidelity Reviews, which is better than nothing, I will tell you. But also, there's really not any way to independently verify that they're aligning with the Fidelity scale. It would be like an organization, like Paul from organization ABC, reviewing his own charts and then submitting the data to QA. It's a measure that says Paul is looking at his charts, but I might not catch all the errors that, an independent set of eyes would catch. And so in the same way, Fidelity brings, I think, a higher level of validation to the work you're doing as an IPS provider. And you'll see with IPS Fidelity Reviews, there are kind of high point components that every Fidelity Review should have. And so I'll just kind of start, and then we'll go into them in more detail, of course. So first is preparation. This is kind of all of the stuff that happens before a Fidelity Review. The agenda, and they're 2-day Fidelity Reviews. So, the agenda, every agenda looks a little bit different whenever you go to an organization, but almost every single agenda contains the same elements, sometimes in different places. But, in every Fidelity Review you go to as a Fidelity Reviewer, you should expect that you will interview, for example, the IPS supervisor or some clients who have accessed the program. Those are all things that are fundamentally part of the review process. There are interviews with a whole host of stakeholders with the IPS team, reviewing documentation in either paper records or electronic medical records, observation of things like team meetings or meetings with other entities, or even observations with the employment specialists as they do job development out in the community. The Fidelity Report is another very valuable component of the Fidelity Review process. That report will include both recommendations and action plans. So, when you think about a Fidelity Review, a lot of times I hear people kind of ask questions like, well, where do you even start? And that's a great question, because it is kind of difficult to think about how do you go from, I'm just a person, maybe working across the state, and then I want to approach some other organization about coming in for 2 days and seeing how they're doing. So the good thing is, I told you last week about the Fidelity Review Manual and how you need to keep that with you at all times when you're doing a Fidelity review. It really guides you through the timeline for preparation. It guides you through the timeline for during the review and then for after the review. So I'm going to flip to that in a few seconds. So just spoiler alert, if you have that accessible to you, I am going to be flipping over to the Fidelity Review Manual in just a couple minutes. But in the preparation, what you're really trying to do with the organization is create that timeline. You have to coordinate a bunch of things, you know, interviews, observations, chart reviews, etc. And if you have multiple Fidelity reviewers at the same time coming into an organization, you know, it's helpful to the organization, the IPS provider, to think in advance of preparations. There's a lot of moving parts. Often there are schedules that people need to, you know, think about or modify or change in order to allow for a Fidelity reviewer to be there. And then at a minimum, scheduling the space as far in advance as possible can be very helpful for an IPS organization. You know, we really want the agency to create the agenda. So we don't want to say, hey, at 9 o'clock, I'm the reviewer, and at 9 o'clock on day one, I'm going to be interviewing all the clients. We want the agency to talk with their internal and external stakeholders and line them up in a way that makes sense to those people. But at a minimum, we need to really see and interview and talk with the key staff, the clients, you know, Department of Vocational Rehab. So there are very clear steps in the Fidelity Review Manual of what needs to be done, but the how of, you know, getting it done really does need to be up to the agency. And then the interviews, when we do the Fidelity review, there are some forms, and certainly as a Fidelity reviewer, you'll have that knowledge of supported employment. To me, a lot of the interviews really end up being, you know, if you have any clinical experience in the first place, what you end up kind of leaning on is that, you know, a number of your questions will have natural follow-up questions that just kind of happen, if that makes any sense. So it might sound daunting as we get into it, but it's not as bad as it sounds or seems. It's not as bad as it sounds or seems. I promise you that much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip over to the Fidelity Review Manual. And so as a reminder, the Fidelity Review Manual is the one with the big red cover right here that Dawn sent out in advance of last week's. And so we're just going to kind of go through it page by page real quickly. When you get to the table of contents, really where we're going to start, and this will be a brief overview for folks. We're going to start, if you remember last week, the version I have, you can click right on Chapter 1, for example. We're going to go right to Chapter 1, which on the page is page 1 of the Fidelity Review Manual. So just to review, you know, we've got the, let me make that a little bigger for everyone. We've got kind of the overview here. A primary use of the Fidelity scale that we reviewed last week is for quality improvement. You know, by monitoring folks over the course of the development, we can really identify areas for improvement. So that Fidelity visit, the Fidelity reviewers really provide feedback to the leadership and the IPS team by kind of independently evaluating how closely they align with the Fidelity scale. And that is via a written report, which is the result of observations, assessments, interviews, chart reviews, and it gives recommendations on each item. So in an item where, let's say, an organization scores a 3, for example, the Fidelity review process will lead to a Fidelity report that says, on this item, we recommend that you do A, B, and C in order to improve your score at the next Fidelity review opportunity. And then the idea there is that the agencies really develop an action plan based on the Fidelity report to address areas that aren't scored 5. So we talked relations, just high points. Certainly we help anybody who expresses an interest in work. We talked about benefits counseling last week. So those are really the principles in that section there. I'm not going to cruise through the Fidelity scale, but I will kind of pause a little bit here and just review the overarching parts of the scale that we talked about. So we talked about in the staffing section, the size of the caseload, the employment services, and the vocational generalist sort of duties that the IPS team has. Then we talked about all of these parts of the organization, whether it's the integration through team assignment or through frequent team member contact. We looked at the collaboration between the IPS team and the vocational rehab counselors, vocational unit. We talked a lot about the supervisor last week. We talked a lot about zero exclusion as well, focus on competitive employment, and the executive team support. And then in the services section, this really is the nuts and bolts of how the team functions. Everything above this in the Fidelity scale is the way it's structured in the organization. The services part is actually really a reflection of the work that's done on the team. So all of these sections are very, very important. Work incentives planning or benefits planning, disclosure, rapid job search, job development, all of those are very, very important. So if you remember in the PowerPoint, I talked about all of these things we look at. There's interviews, there's record, and really this section here talks about the sources of information you would expect to see on a Fidelity review. The Fidelity scale, if you don't see certain evidence, you cannot score higher than a certain score. Information about the organization, and so you might find some organizations have like a binder they prepare for you. Others kind of just put brochures or a folder filled with brochures or information in front of you. That might include things like newsletters that the organization puts out. You're also going to have either access to their record or an employee will walk you through the record in order to see some of the things in the medical record. And then you'll also do interviews with IPS staff, non-IPS staff, clients of the IPS team, families of those clients. Not so much teachers if you're just doing straight IPS. This really would include if you're also doing supportive education, which not every place is. Vocational rehab counselors, benefits counselors. You'll do observations of mental health treatment team meetings. You'll do observations of the IPS team meeting. You will observe IPS specialists doing job development. You'll review their kind of internal documentation, so they might have a job development log, for example, that you look at. They might have QA data that you look at, and they might have other tracking mechanisms in place that the supervisor uses to make sure that the team is doing what they need to be doing that should be available to you, and then client record reviews as well. And so we talked about what is rated last week. So here's a good example. The scale ratings are based on current activities and service organization, not planned or intended. And that's a real key indicator because you will hear at a Fidelity review an agency talk about how they have this big elaborate thing planned for their IPS team. But as a reviewer, you have to rate kind of today, not tomorrow. So you would be rating them based on what they're doing today, and those plans are great. And you could put in the recommendations, follow through with those plans. But in this example they give here, in order to give full credit for this item, it's not sufficient for agency leaders to plan to organize the specialists into a unit. And this talks about the vocational unit is 2 IPS specialists and a supervisor. So if they talked about putting that together, but they don't have it today, what you do is you rate on how the IPS specialists function at the time of your visit. That's really the threshold and the cutoff. And then you would certainly make a comment about their plans to create the team, but you have to review what is there today. So this part, I think, is also important to really keep in mind when you are talking with the team. A lot of the teams, the IPS specialists and the supervisors are going to feel like, even though you have not said this, they're going to feel like you're there to evaluate them personally on their worth as an employee. And so it's important, and if you have to say it regularly, that's okay, but the scale isn't appropriate for measuring specific clinicians. The scale is appropriate, however, for assessing the IPS supported employment at the agency and team level. So when you're having an interview with an IPS employment specialist, often, it's important for you to share with them that, we're not here to evaluate you specifically. We're here to evaluate the team and the organization and give you the, ideas on how you can be the best at IPS that you can be. To give them some of that permission, if you want to think about it that way, to give them permission to really answer, unrestricted and honestly. It's a real danger zone for organizations when they kind of filter their answers to you. It's not like an audit, where there's financial penalties or anything like that. We're truly there as Fidelity Reviewers to help them get better. So it should be a real collaborative environment, and as a Fidelity Reviewer, it is really your responsibility to help establish that right out of the gates. As I've indicated, this section here, time required to complete the review, this is on page 5 of the Fidelity Review Manual. At a minimum, we say about a day and a half to complete. If you've got 2 reviewers, it might be a full 2 days. Every agency is a little different. Every reviewer is a little different. If you're a newer IPS Fidelity Reviewer, it might take you longer to kind of get to the answers you need, both in interviews and especially things like record reviews. What I find very difficult about chart reviews, for example, is that every organization you visit has a completely different medical record. Some are paper, some are electronic, some are both. And it really, I try to get in there on day one and really understand it, because it takes a while to really orient yourself to a medical record that is not familiar to you. So word to the wise there, don't put off record reviews until day 2, unless you want to stay until the very end of the day on day 2, because it can take a while to orient yourself to the medical record. The size of the agency is something to take into account with regards to time. I've been to organizations, the organization I've been to that has the highest number of IPS teams has 12 teams, and it is impossible for us, even with 3 reviewers, to review 12 teams worth of work. So what we do with that organization is, unfortunately for that organization, they have about 4 Fidelity reviews a year, and we review parts of their teams. Or we review like 4 teams at a time, for example. It's more time, both from a reviewer perspective and from an organization perspective, to do that. But to be fair, that's the only way for us. It's the only way we've found to do it. And if you think about just the observations of job development for employment specialists, reviewing 12 teams of employment specialist job development alone would take 2 days worth of observational community visits. So that's been our approach for that organization. It's worked out pretty well. So here, there's an example. If the agency has 5 mental health treatment teams, reviewers should expect to observe 2 or 3 meetings during the visit, which would require more time, obviously, to complete the visit than an agency that only has 1 mental health treatment team. So those are all factors in the beginning that will help you figure out, A, how many reviewers are best for that organization, and B, how do we want to split up the time in a way that we can make it manageable. The data collection, I talked a little bit about this, observation of treatment team meetings, group interviews with the executive team, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about a lot of this last week. This is how we do the work as a Fidelity Reviewer. And so you see here some kind of validation to my comment there. When an agency has multiple IPS teams, reviewers conduct a separate review for each team, but usually interview the agency's executive leadership just once annually. That is true, absolutely true. That's how we do it in most of the states that I've done Fidelity Reviews. I pointed this out last week as well. This manual does not recommend telephone interviews. I think there are just, for most Fidelity Reviews, you're going to have to do a phone interview at some point or another. The example I gave last week in Illinois, we have very few benefits planners for the entire state, and so they are not local to probably 90% of the teams that get Fidelity reviews. So the only way to interview benefits planners is to get them on the phone. It's not ideal, but it's better than not interviewing them. So you may find that at specific organizations for specific things, you do have to do a phone interview. The other example I'll give you also there is often when you're interviewing, let's say, a provider-level prescriber, often due to their schedule, especially at an organization with multiple sites, you may be forced into a phone conversation with that provider as well. And again, it's not maybe ideal, but it's better than nothing. It's better than no interview.
Hey, Paul.
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. I have a question that shows up from Dwayne.
Sure.
It says, I know the size of the caseload is an important part of the scoring. Does the size also include other organizations that the team works with, such as DBR clients?
Thank you for checking the questions, Dawn. I really appreciate that. I was working my way up to a minute to do that. So let's look at Dwayne's question here. The size of the caseload is an important part of the scoring. Does the size include other organizations? So the Fidelity review process and the Fidelity scale will really only review the IPS team. So I think, and questions like this kind of came up last week, Dawn. So it depends on how the organization kind of sets it up, I guess, Dwayne, is the best way for me to answer this question. So some organizations, for example, you mentioned DVR clients, for example. Some organizations count DVR as a referral source, and so they have a caseload, an employment specialist whose caseload has DVR client referrals on it. And so in that example, we would include, quote, other organizations that the team works with, like DVR clients. A very confusing example that I mentioned last week, and I'm not sure if you were on last week or not, Dwayne, but at an organization in Kansas, they have multiple funding streams to support supported employment, and only one of them is identified as IPS. And so the employment specialists there, for example, have a caseload of, let's say, 45 people. And during the IPS Fidelity review, they gave us a caseload list that showed 45 clients. And when we said these are all IPS clients, they said, no, only 20 are IPS. So they had an additional 25 other clients from other places. I don't recall exactly where all of those places were from, but they were dictated by the funding streams associated with that level of supported employment. So it was very confusing to sort out, and it was extremely confusing to try to give them what we considered as reviewers a very fair score, because on one hand, they had way higher caseloads than IPS recommends. IPS recommends 20, right, or fewer. But on the other hand, their quote-unquote IPS caseload was only 20 people. So we literally spent about a day and a half as reviewers on every break, kind of just going back and forth with how we should score it. And ultimately, we determined we should score it as their caseloads are way higher than recommended. Even though they have it separated into all these different teams or referral sources or other organizations, the reality is their time is split. And so I think the best answer to your question is when there are other organizations that the teams works with, like DVR clients, or I'll just make something up, like a substance use disorder facility, then I think what we really have to review it as reviewers is we really have to review it from the perspective of how does it impact the employment specialist overall time that they spend on IPS, because I think that's the principle of the measure. Team size is not can you get by calling things different names. It's less of that and more of how does an organization obligate employment specialists to supported employment? And if you're slicing and dicing it up into 6 different ways or something, I think that really gets at the wrong direction of the spirit of the Fidelity scale. That's a great question, Dwayne, and a stumper too. So keep those questions coming, guys. I really appreciate it. I talked a lot last week about how, since we're not doing these face-to-face, it's a new thing for me to try to do a training without seeing anybody. Often, hopefully you agree with me, but you really depend on people's facial expressions to determine whether or not they're picking up kind of what we're talking about. So if you have a question, it doesn't matter how silly you think it is, please ask it. I think I see another one that came through. So Tom asked, is it recommended or is there any standard for interviewing IPS program participants who are either employed or looking for work? We'll get to that in a second here, Tom. I don't know if I'd go so far as to describe it as a standard. Ideally, you'd like to see folks that are working currently. I like to bring clients in when they have worked but are no longer working, and really what you get by getting a mix of people who are working currently or looking for work or who have a history of work with the team is you get a real global picture of the before, the job search. Then you get, for people who are working, you get a look at the job supports. And then for the people who are no longer working, you get an idea from them how the team helped them try to get back into the job search if that's what they were interested in. I also like to throw in family members when we can hear from family members of a loved one who's working or has worked. It's really nice to hear from a family member's perspective how the team has indirectly impacted the family by helping their loved one secure employment, competitive employment in the community. Those are really neat things to hear. And what I do when I write a Fidelity report, those are super awesome quotes that you can put in a Fidelity report that I think really uplift the team, because I've done this work and a lot of you are doing this work right now. We don't hear that a lot from family members. Sometimes we do, sure, but it's really nice to hear from a family member that, the IPS team has really helped change their life by helping their loved one become more independent. Those are great quotes to put in a Fidelity report. And if organizations are doing things the way I do it, you take that Fidelity report with those wonderful quotes right to your board and show off all the good work you're doing right before you ask for more money, right? That's the whole idea. That's a great question, Tom. And we would want, best case scenario, we would want a mix. Unfortunately, often the interviews are dependent upon people's schedule and often their work schedule. So in a weird way, you might find you get to an organization and they have a really hard time getting people who are employed to take time away from work to come talk with the reviewer. We certainly wouldn't want to have 0 people that are employed doing an interview, but you might get 1, and it might be more realistic for you to think about that you get more people that are in a job search kind of status than people who are employed, because people got employed. So let's keep going here. And just so people know, at about 11:50, I'm at 11:33 right now, my time. So in about 18 minutes, 17 minutes, I will take about a 5-minute break for people who might need to, stretch their legs or something. That's what I was doing last week, and it seemed to work out pretty well. And basically, we'll just mute, and then we'll come right back in about 3 to 5 minutes. So who does the ratings? So this is really asking who's a good Fidelity reviewer. So it's certainly people who have experience in training and interviewing and data collection, which, based on Dawn's explanation of who's involved in the state of Washington right now, I think all of you certainly meet those criteria. Really, the tricky one, I think, for folks ends up being getting your experience as a Fidelity reviewer. It's hard to go from being an IPS supervisor or an employment specialist to a Fidelity reviewer overnight. So certainly understanding the philosophy and the elements of IPS are important. But ideally, if you had unlimited resources, what you'd have would be you'd pair up very experienced Fidelity reviewers with those that have less experience. And you'd give those with less experience several opportunities to really learn from that person with the experience and really understand how they can not necessarily interpret things, but how they can evaluate the evidence an IPS team has provided in regards to the scale. It's rarely black or white. Often it is in the the people part of it. But for the most part, every agency's version of a career profile might look different than what your team uses. And so you've got to really spend time as a reviewer orienting yourself to what you're looking at and then how to interpret it. And so that's where having somebody with some experience can really be helpful. It says here, finally, whenever possible, it's recommended that teams include clients trained in conducting Fidelity visits or family members who can provide a unique perspective. That's kind of to Tom's question. That's a really important piece. And then the manual recommends a maximum of 4 reviewers, depending on the size of the program. In Illinois, we do 3. In Kansas, I've done 3. And that's pretty much the standard. I think it's a game changer if you're kind of training a Fidelity reviewer, though. So I could see where you might have 5 reviewers, 2 of which are in training, in some level of training, because at the end of the day, you have to do the reviews, and in order to get the experience, you have to do the reviews. So anytime we can bring new reviewers along is very, very helpful. At the bottom of page 7 here in the manual, or in the middle, I'm sorry, it talks about kind of the basic skills and experience recommended to become a Fidelity reviewer. And really, it's exactly what you think it is. Knowledge of IPS supported employment, practice applying the Fidelity scale. So that's it. That's the part I'm talking about. It's a challenge sometimes for people who have never applied the Fidelity scale outside their own organization, and then experience observing an IPS Fidelity review. And that means not your own, if you're an organization that does IPS right now. In Illinois, they did a really unique thing for people who wanted to become certified IPS Fidelity reviewers. We had to observe 6 Fidelity reviews, and these were, there was no payment involved for those. It was on your own time, and once you observed 6, you could move to the next step in the Fidelity review certification. But it was their determination in Illinois that 6 was the basic, like the very base level number that it would take to kind of have seen a wide swath of how organizations interpret the Fidelity scale. I know in Washington, Dawn is going to be one of the Fidelity reviewers, and then certainly all of you, I hope, move forward and become Fidelity reviewers. It's a really, really great opportunity to learn more about IPS. It's a really, really great opportunity to help your own program by learning what others are doing. And really the goal, is we want people who are competent raters. So, if Dawn and Paul go to an organization on the west side of the state in January and we give them 111, when 2 different reviewers come over next January and, if they give them a 125, we want to make sure that our scores are consistent. And that's really, I think, to me, the most important part of Fidelity reviewing is the consistency. It's really unfair to an organization if their scores are widely unreliable, and you never want to be in a situation where your score is dependent on which rater shows up. So it's important to get the practice. It's important to get the knowledge. It's important to observe when you can, just so you're the best reviewer you can be. I talked briefly about missing data last week too. Really. Every item has to be scored. If you can't get information that's necessary for a score, you try to get it before you leave. And if you can't find the information at the end of everything, then the default value is a 1. And for most items, like we learned last week, you can't score above a 1 if you have no evidence. And so this is one of those sentences. Well, these 2 are those sentences, like I said last week, you want to put in your manual a little star by or highlight or whatever will draw your eye to it. Even if an item does not appear to apply to an agency, the item is still rated. So the example is if an agency doesn't have mental health treatment teams, they're scored a 1 or a 2, and that's true. However, I will direct you all back to what we talked about last week in Washington, how we've expanded the way we view treatment teams to be more than just mental health treatment teams. So I think, again, with experienced raters there, I know Washington's done some Fidelity reviews already. That should be okay. That should not be something you encounter frequently in the state of Washington, from my understanding. I'm going to skip over supported education and the Fidelity report. I'm going to go right to preparing, which like an hour ago is what I said we were going to talk about, right? Sorry. So at on page 10 in the Fidelity Manual, it talks about preparing for the Fidelity site visit. So the way we do it in Illinois, and Dawn can talk about how we do it in Washington, but the way we do it in Illinois is basically we send a letter to the organization that starts the conversation about what dates are going to be best, So we identify on the front end reviewers and which kind of windows are available for them to do the reviews. So we send a letter to the organization that says, here are 3 or 4 different dates that would work for your reviewer team. Could you please select one and let us know? And so the organization really schedules it from a small section of potential dates that we could do. And then what we do is once we get the date, then we start talking with them about all of the preparation, all of the prep work. So we talked, we want to make sure we establish a contact person, for example, one person, not 6 people at an agency, but one person you can email to get some of this information. So we want to try to schedule well in advance. We want to talk with one person. We want to understand, too, that we're telling them, here are 4 different 2-day windows you can pick from. And, you know, there's some professional courtesy, I think, if none of those work, that we have to try to get back to the drawing board. And again, we're not trying to stick it to anybody. We're really trying to be collaborative to find a date that works where they can fit us into their schedule, because it is a 2-day ordeal. And it is a lot to ask the team to put everything together and host us and schedule all of these things. And, you know, they're really taking time out of their daily work to host us for 2 days. So I always encourage Fidelity reviewers to, you know, just show some grace when people can't make it work on the dates that we think were available. Just be flexible. So they include in the manual, and I really like this, kind of a sample timeline. So if you walk through this, you should have a lead reviewer, somebody who's kind of the go-to person for your review team. And basically you send an outline of the Fidelity review activities, and you ask to kind of narrow down to a date, and then you include some of these things that you need to get scheduled, and then you're going to request from them documentation. That's October 10. Then a little bit less than a month later, you're going to contact them again. If nothing's been sent, you're going to review any potential schedule to make sure all the necessary activities are included. I will tell you, if I stop right here, if sometimes communication is the hardest part of the work we do, right? And so if you get to an organization and they have forgotten to schedule, let's say the interview with the IPS supervisor, I'm just making something up, it is well within your rights as a reviewer on day one to look at the schedule and ask, were we going to have time to interview the IPS supervisor? Often there's nothing sinister that's happening. Often what happens is an organization forgets in the scurry of getting everything together, or sometimes they'll think they put it in there, but what they really put in there was like the IPS team interview, and they didn't separate out the IPS supervisor. And those are all things that are okay, and those are all things that are fair game for a reviewer to say on day one, hey, don't forget, we need to talk with the supervisor so we can score it adequately. And then if you go down to November 11th there, about a month later, you should be at least via phone call or email confirming the visit, confirming the schedule, confirming where to meet. For organizations with many sites, you really want to make sure you know what building do the reviewers go to on day one. And you really want to make sure when you look at the schedule for places with multiple sites that they don't have reviewers separated multiple times during the day, or too many things scheduled at one time for the number of reviewers you have. So for example, often agencies I should say, will schedule job development observation, which is out in the community, and at the same time they might schedule 2 interviews. And if you have 2 reviewers, it's impossible. You can't interview 2 people at the same time, depending on their positions, while you're having a reviewer go out into the field to do job development observation. So those are all the little things that really you just need to make sure that we're not scheduling people to be in 2 places at once. So in this timeline, November 13th and 14th are the Fidelity visit, and then November 16th, the Fidelity reviewers meet, it says by phone if necessary, to do the final scores. So I do it a little differently. So during my Fidelity reviews, the agency has what we describe as a preliminary score on the end of day 2 in the Fidelity review. Then what we do is we do this next step where the Fidelity reviewers meet, and we're typically meeting by phone to what I consider to be verifying the final scores. You should be able to have a preliminary score before you leave the agency. Dawn, if you're out there, Dawn, and able to, is that the current practice in Washington?
I am here, Paul. What we end up doing, three things that I wanted to mention. One is that we're doing a limited number of Fidelity reviews. So anyone who's on a team is going to be on a team with either me as a lead reviewer or Darren Paskey, my counterpart on the west side, as a lead reviewer. So nobody's going to have to do that piece of lead review. That's going to be up to Darren and I. And what we tend to do is we give a little bit of time after the review if we haven't gotten all the information that we need for the agency to turn it in, usually a week. And so because of that, we haven't necessarily got the Fidelity scores at the end of the day. We tell the agency that we're going to get together as a review team and do consensus scoring, and that we're going to hold off to give them the scores until that time, because we have allowed them a little extra time to get the information to us. We want them to score as well as they possibly can. And so it's important to us to make sure that we've gotten every piece of information that we need in order to score the items. So
Okay,
a little bit different.
A little bit different, and not right or wrong either. You know, just to be real fair. Every state and really every reviewer kind of has their own style, and so that's perfectly fine. And I know. I always tell agencies, you know, you shouldn't be depending on me to figure out what your score is, because if you know your program, you should have a good idea, at least a range of scores that you think I get, depending on what you can produce, you know, as evidence. So that's in line, certainly in line. And then I think the timeline gets a little explicit here, but November 20th, the first draft of the report written by the lead reviewer is shared with the other reviewers for feedback and edits. November 27th, the final report is sent off. And December 10th, reviewers speak with agency staff who requested to review or summarize findings, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I think there are some of those steps there at the end that can be condensed a little bit. I think the important pieces certainly are the pre-work, the fidelity visit, the consensus scoring, and then the final report being sent to the staff. The last thing you'd want to do is have a long delay between the fidelity review and the final report being sent out. That's difficult for an agency then to turn into a fidelity action plan. Let's see here.
Well, very honestly, it's nerve-wracking for the agency because they want to know, you know, I think to some degree the scores are nice, but the recommendations and comments are even more important than that, and they won't get to see those till they see the report.
Correct. Yeah, and the recommendations too. You know, often, I mean, the fidelity scale is very clear with what is a 5 and what is a 4 and what is a 3 and a 2 and a 1. So often the recommendations are in the comments are the important part that the teams really go to first. Almost all teams, and my team is guilty of it, you know, almost all teams go right to the final score, and then they go to the comments and recommendations next. So, you know, we're all competitive in our own ways, I think, for sure. But to Dawn, to your point, the comments, the recommendations, those are the pieces that I think are really the valuable parts. The rating is the rating, but the recommendation and comments kind of tell you the why behind it. This is an important, it's top of page 11, or bottom of page 11, top of page 12. So really it's important, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, it's important, every interview you sit down to as a fidelity reviewer, to talk about the purpose of the review. The purpose of the review is not, you know, an audit. Nobody's going to get in trouble because somebody scored a 4 or a 3. And the reality is, if people fear that the report is going to include low scores, or if that the agency is going to lose funding, for example, based on their answer, you know, you really start to question the accuracy of the answers you get from, especially the interviews, right? So the best possible scenario you can set right when you walk in the door is that this quote is great, right? The purpose of this review is to help people get more jobs. Help more people get jobs. So, you know, you don't have to use that quote, for example, but that really is what we're trying to do. We know, based on the research, that agencies that score in higher fidelity ranges help more people get jobs. So our job as reviewers is not to, you know, cook the books or anything like that. We're there to help people, help agencies be the best IPS provider they can be, because we know, based on research, that will help more people get jobs. So the more that you can reassure people that people just give you accurate and complete information, the better for everybody, really. And we tell that to the executive team regularly. Often, you know, I don't mean this in the wrong way, but sometimes executives, you know, they do what I call the brochure version of things sometimes, where it's all the good things and leave out all the bad things. And that's okay. They have to do that. That's sort of a self-preservation thing at some level for an executive. But, you know, even giving permission to the executives to say, where do you feel like you guys struggle in IPS-supported employment, can go a long way towards giving them permission, in a sense, to tell you, you know, gosh, what we would really like is a better relationship with our local Department of Vocational Rehab. We have made all these efforts, and it's not where we want it to be. Those are things that are good to know as a reviewer that won't penalize anybody, but those are recommendations you can make, and you can talk to Department of Vocational Rehab in your interview with them about that very thing. So often, the Fidelity Reviewer is kind of this intermediary, you know, for a lot of this information. So bear with me, guys. We got about 4 or 5 minutes before we get to a break, and I'll stop for questions there at that time too. So be thinking about your questions. So at the top of page 12 is this list of information to request from a site. So in the preparation stage, when you start a Fidelity Review, the lead reviewer might be asking for some combination of these things, either in advance, sent to the Fidelity Reviewers, or available when you get there for the Fidelity Review. I've been on Fidelity Reviews where we do it both ways. You know, I've been on some where it's sent out beforehand via email, others where it's available on site when you get there. It's probably more likely that it's going to be available on site when you get there, and a big part of that is because often some of these things that you're asking for have sensitive information on them that either people are not able to email, or they have a hesitation in emailing it, and I understand that, and so we're very flexible with that. As long as it's available and we can see it, it should be fine. There are some situations, however, where maybe due to time constraints, you may want that emailed out in advance so that reviewers can show up and not have to spend time doing that, having that as part of the review. And then the last thing I'll say is one of the things I've been a part of for the last 2 years is a kind of a test to see if for well-established organizations that score above a certain threshold in the fidelity scale, if we could get by with some email documentation that reviewers review prior to the Fidelity Review, and then a one-day on-site Fidelity Review that is comprised mostly of face-to-face interviews and job development observation. And that's, you know, it's going about as well as you can expect. There's some hits and some misses, but that's not any different than a 2-day review where this is available on site, and, you know, maybe an organization that doesn't document very well isn't able to give you a real complete picture. So I don't know if that'll come out as a recommendation from IPS Works, that, you know, well-established programs could do 1-day reviews, but that's something they're thinking about anyway. So you can see here, you know, a list of current jobs held, including job titles, job start dates, job end dates. It's very prescriptive here. Number of people who have participated in a career profile during the past 6 months, vacancies for the last 6 months, an agency brochure or program descriptions. If an agency's already had a Fidelity Review, you know, a copy of their Fidelity Action Plan or Implementation Plan would be great to look at. And then access to at least 10 records. I will tell you, I think I mentioned earlier, some organizations have no problem giving like an auditor type login to their medical record if it's electronic. Other places are a little bit more rigid, and so then what we would ask then is that they make somebody available to cruise through the record while we are there. Some agencies are very protective of their medical record, and I understand that, and so when you want to see the career profile, for example, they print it out. You know, not wrong. It creates a lot of paper and, you know, that sort of thing, but we don't ever go in and tell people they should or shouldn't do a certain thing with regard to access to their record. That's kind of up to the organization. List of activities. Let me stop at list of activities. I'm going to just kind of open it up for questions right now. and see if there's questions about any of this that we've covered so far or anything we haven't covered yet.
And you can either raise your hand, and I see Linda has her hand and has had her hand raised for a while, and I'm going to try and unmute you, Linda. But you can either raise your hand or you can type a question into the comment, the chat box, I should say. Okay. Linda, it looks like you're self-muted on your end in addition to, I just unmuted you, I believe, and you're self-muted from your end. So if you want to unmute, you can ask the question if it's still relevant. Paul, I just have to say, I am so tickled that this is working. It's going. There haven't been huge no, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to jinx it.
Don't jinx it.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not going to do that. I am just tickled to death. It's all working this morning. Yay! Yeah, Linda, it looks like you're still self-muted. So if you want to make comment, please feel free to unmute yourself from your end. And that may be, in fact, turning up volume on your speakers, I would think, which would turn up on the microphone as well.
And Linda, if it's easier for you to type into the questions box, that's okay too.
Absolutely. All right, and I don't see other questions at this point in time, so I think people took you seriously, Paul, when you said, get up and stretch and take a brief break. And
I did that last week, and I think it went over well. I mean, not just for me, of course, but I mean, it's a long chunk of time to sit and listen to somebody. It's always better face-to-face because people can just speak up or raise their hand. So what I did last week, Dawn, and I hope it's okay, is I just kind of said, let's get back in about 5 minutes or so. And so I'll start up again. I'm going to mute myself, but I'm going to start up again at about 12:00. Well, they just turned 11:58. So I'll start up again at about 12:03. And then, you know, we'll turn it out as people are coming back for questions again for a minute or so, and then we'll just pick right up where we left off.
So Paul is obviously from 2 time zones away, so that's 10:03 our time.
I'm sorry, yes. Yeah, I need to have you everywhere I go, or everybody I talk to in Washington, the intermediary for me. So I will talk with everybody in about 5 minutes. Okay, everybody. So I am back. It's about 12:03 my time, 10:03 your time. And funny story, if you leave your office while you're facilitating a webinar, make sure that you have your key with you so you don't have to run around the entire building trying to find somebody that'll unlock your door. So that's my wisdom that I would share with you today. Definitely got a leg stretch.
Oh, dear.
Really? Yeah. Well, I started to get worried because it's lunchtime basically here, and 99% of the people are out of the building right now. So I started to wonder how I was ever going to get back onto this webinar. But nonetheless,
dear.
here I am. Yeah, here I am.
Good job.
So I'll just cruise through questions. Okay, no new questions, which is fine. So let's start talking about, we talked about the agency creating the agenda and the interviews for Fidelity Review. And so some of the activities and interviews that an agency really needs to schedule for an interview, you'll see are, there are a lot of things to put into 2 days. And I'll note here, it recommends kind of the length in parentheses behind each of the things. So some agencies do things differently than others. And I think at some point as reviewers, you just have to roll with it. There's not a prescription for every single thing you're going to see. And an example I'll give you is the third bullet point: observe at least one mental health treatment team meeting, and then it says 1 hour. I was at a review at one point where there were many mental health treatment teams, and there were so many, in fact, that they did not have 1 hour treatment team meetings. They had what they described as huddles, and those huddles lasted probably a maximum of about 20 minutes, but they had them every single day. So, you know, the review team really just kind of had to go with it because it's what they did, and there's really not, you know, any language in the Fidelity scale that says if it's not an hour, they don't get a point or anything like that. So we kind of defaulted to, you know, the employment team was at every mental health treatment team every single day, regardless of whether they were 20 minutes or 15 minutes or, you know, if they went long. So we thought in the spirit of it, we awarded them all the points that they needed just because they were doing what their organization said to do, and it met the standard, we thought. So it's important to be flexible as you can with the scale while still meeting the criteria. So certainly we want to meet with the IPS supervisor. Now, it says for a brief orientation to the agency. 9 agencies out of 10 for a brief orientation to the agency have the IPS team, the IPS supervisor. Often they'll have like a person who's the director of the employment team, and then a couple people from the executive team. So you might also, in that orientation to the agency, usually on day 1, right out of the gates at 8:30 or 9 in the morning, you might also meet with the CEO or the VP for that organization. Just, again, brief overview to the agency. Nothing, doesn't have to be any real interview at that point, but they're like welcoming the reviewers there. So I think that's why most have those folks there. You certainly want to observe the vocational unit meeting. You want to have at least 1 mental health treatment team meeting under your belt before you leave. And it says here if they have more than 1 treatment team meeting, reviewers should review more than 1. That's really going to depend on if it's scheduled for you. Often you'll show up on a review on, let's say, like a Wednesday, Thursday. Those are your 2 days. And, you know, you might have an agency tell you, well, we don't have any team meetings on Wednesday or Thursday, so we scheduled one just because you're here. In those cases, you just observe what you observe. If there are no other meetings happening and you want to see another meeting, you can ask if they can do one, but the agency has the right to tell you no. So then you just have to score what you see in one meeting in that case. Interviews with agency's executive leaders, which includes executive director, quality assurance director, and clinical director. That can be a group interview. Often it's a group interview rather than trying to get those folks in 3 different interviews. I will say too that because the Fidelity scale has a couple items that look for IPS's integration into the quality assurance program of the organization, is very important for you to talk with the quality assurance director. And many agencies have somebody who is in another position that wears the hat of the quality assurance director. And when you're in a situation like that where it's unclear to you, I think it's best to just be direct and ask. If it's the clinical director that you think is doing the QA, you can just ask, do you operate as the quality assurance director as well? And they're either going to say yes or no, that's Bob or Jane or whoever. Then you'll really want to talk with whoever is functioning as the QA director. It might not be that particular title. The medical director or psychiatrist, or now many places use advanced practice nurses as prescribers. So, somebody in that kind of prescriber realm or medical director realm. Ideally, we talk with 3 case managers or therapists or service coordinators. And what you really want to make sure of is, if Dawn interviews, an agency ABC in 2019, and she talks with Eva, the therapist, when I come into that same agency in 2020, I don't want to talk with Eva again. It's great that she shared and everything, but we really need to make sure that we kind of rotate around and talk with different therapists or case managers or whoever to the degree that you can. And usually that's not a problem. You might end up seeing the same folks over the course of several years, but usually agencies don't put the same person in front of you every time. The next bullet point is observing at least 2 IPS specialists as they meet with employers doing job development, right? So it says avoid shadowing the same specialists in subsequent Fidelity visits. So every Fidelity review I've been to, first of all, we shadow all of the employment specialists. I've not been to one where there are so many that we are unable to do it. So a couple things about job development observations. It says 1 hour to 90 minutes, and that's about fair for your entire time together. Often, the first thing I ask is, are they scheduled appointments or unscheduled? And if they're unscheduled, that's fine, but certainly with scheduled appointments, you want to respect the time of the employment specialist and the employer. Often at Fidelity Reviews, time gets away in interviews and things start late and end late, and so if you just need to know if they're scheduled or unscheduled right out of the gates, so that you're not showing up late for an observation with the employment specialist, because it's really unfair to the employment specialist for us to make them late to a scheduled appointment with an employer. So that being said, I like to see somebody they have an existing relationship with, and I like to see them interact with an employer that they would describe as not having an existing relationship with. If we can get both of those done in 30 or 45 minutes, sometimes I say, do you want to just see if we can find some place with a now hiring sign or something like that, or if you have a lead you'd like to try to track down. Sometimes it's easier than others. In larger cities, it's actually more difficult because sometimes the travel time due to traffic is out of control. If you do a Fidelity review in Chicago, for example, it's not just as easy as going from the north side to the south side of Chicago in 1 hour. Oftentimes, those employment specialists spend about 2+ hours a day just sitting in their car in traffic. So you really have to be flexible. Ideally, you're at least seeing somebody they have an existing relationship with and somebody that they're either just starting a relationship with or have only met with once or twice. And then that will help you really get a feel for overall kind of how they do the work of job development, or it should, I guess I should say. Interviewing individual IPS specialists, and it says here to collect data not observed. Most agencies are pretty upfront with all the data they can give you. They want to give you all the data they can so that you can give them the right score. The next bullet point at the top of this page here is the small group of clients who have received services. Often that is combined with the next bullet point, which are family members. Sometimes family members are interviews you'll talk with on the phone. Maybe they are employed or so on and so forth. The schedule doesn't work out. And again, that's okay. Again, it's important to be flexible. Not everybody can take time out of their day to come talk with us. It's important that you have a sample of at least 10 records. And really the reason and rationale behind 10 records, you could do more if you want. 10 records get you some easy percentages. A lot of the items, if you remember from last week, we had to score as percentages. So 10 gets you some easy percentages if you're like me and you didn't get into this field because you like math. It'd be great to have at least 10. Often agencies, especially agencies that are new to IPS, they might not have 10, and so in each Fidelity item, they have some, I should say, there are specifics about if you can't have 10 records, what you should do. You'd want to talk with the Department of Vocational Rehab liaison counselor, if there is one, or a supervisor. You'd want to talk with a benefits planner. You'd want to talk with any IPS peer specialists if they're available, and then certainly interview the IPS supervisors. That's probably a short list of all the stuff you'd want, all the interviews you'd want to see. And if you start to think about combining that with, the observation of job development, the observation of team meetings, the record reviews, et cetera, you can see real quickly how 2 days is very, very full. And so it's important for reviewers to try to be mindful of the time just to keep things moving, if nothing else. I'm trying to see other high points here. There is, in this manual, a sample of the letter you might send out, and it sounds like Dawn and her team are going to kind of be on point for those letters. So for many of you on the call, that's not something you have to compose. Dawn may include you on the email, I would imagine, with that letter being sent out.
That's right. Absolutely do.
Okay, good. So the other thing to think about with record reviews is kind of a random sample. I've been to organizations where they have a stack of paper charts and they say pick 10, and I've been to others where they have a stack of 10 charts and say these are the 10 we picked. It's important that the charts are randomly selected, but it's also important that the logistics of picking out those 10 are really handled by the agency. They've got some specifics here which I think are very important. 3 records of people who are scheduled to be interviewed, so the clients that you've met or will meet during the Fidelity review process. 2 records of people who are no longer receiving IPS. 5 records for people who have started work within the past 6 months. It doesn't mean they have to stay employed. And 3 records for people in job search or in school if people are doing that IPS supportive education. In an ideal world, they give you way more than 10, but the other side of that is you only have 2 days as reviewers, and that's okay. So 10 is great if they can get you 10, and most places can get you 10, no problem. Here's a good tip, too, for you to star or highlight in your manual. If we can do it, it's minimally interruptive to schedule a Fidelity review on the day that the mental health treatment team or IPS team meets, because sometimes that's very difficult to reschedule, as you might imagine. You could, according to the manual, ask if you could visit a meeting after the Fidelity visit. I don't really recommend that very often, just because once you leave, I think it is really important to kind of keep the process moving towards a conclusion of a Fidelity report. And anything you put in between the end of the Fidelity review and the Fidelity report really just delays things. And it's also important to note if they send you a schedule and it's not complete, talk to that contact person, a supervisor, whoever that is. We need to see as much as we can see in order to score adequately. And then here's kind of a sample schedule of how your day might go. And again, starting right out of the gates at 8:30, it's pretty much start to finish with a lunch, and then all the way up to the end of the day. And you can see, this doesn't really leave a bunch of time between meetings or anything like that. And so what I do when I get there as a Fidelity reviewer, one of the first things I do with the review team is we look at the schedule for day 1, for example, and we start to not move things around as much as we just kind of see, okay, I'm trying to find a good example here. Let's say they had the client interviews broken out into 3 separate interviews, we might ask, can we consolidate that to a group interview? And it's okay if we can't. We might also say, okay, so at 1 o'clock, Paul is going to do the client record review, which means we could move up the interview with the mental health treatment team supervisor to 1 o'clock. And then, we could start to kind of get some extra time in the 2 days by not really moving things around as much as just asking if we can move things around, so that we make. I always like to leave room for client record review. Like I said, this 1.5 hours here, even with all the reviewers, might not be enough, and you might not know enough about the agency to really understand the contents of the record yet at 1 o'clock on day 1. If you move over into day 2, you can see they end at 1 o'clock, but that's after a records review from 11:30 to 1. So you just want to make sure you have room if you need it in the schedule as a reviewer. I think it's very important. If you just go all the way through it as is scheduled and you don't make any accommodations for things that might happen or could happen, then what ends up happening is on day 2, at 4:59, you're still not anywhere near close to scoring or, getting all the scores you might need for particular items. And so then you're in trouble because you're looking at potentially extending it into a 3rd day just to get all the information you need. So you definitely want to avoid that. You definitely want to avoid that. And then the last thing I'll say here is for confidentiality, some agencies may require that you sign a confidentiality agreement because of the client information you'll see. We always tell people, to the degree that you can abbreviate or remove client names, please do so. To the degree that you can de-identify, please do so. And then as a reviewer team, we don't like to take any documents with us. So between day 1 and day 2, I'm not going to review anything in a hotel room or anything like that. If I can't review it during the day, I'm going to leave it there at the organization where it can be locked up and secured, and then I'll come back tomorrow and review it again. The last thing you want to be is in a situation where, as a reviewer, you've lost like a caseload list somewhere in the community, or it's been taken from your car or whatever. So just, again, you have a responsibility as a reviewer to maintain and guard the confidentiality as well. So I think that is just very important for everybody to really understand. So we talked a little bit about kind of the prep work. We talked about the documentation here, what we should ask for in the beginning, and the list of places they've worked. And a lot of these are absolutely necessary for you to score certain items. That's why we ask for them. So you do, if you remember from last week, there is an item where you're reviewing how much time employment specialists spend in the agency or in the community. So one of the things that we didn't mention in the manual is you're going to want to get some sort of documentation indicating a location of services provided by employment specialists. It's very, very important. Another thing that I don't think we mentioned in the manual is job development logs. Often agencies categorize their job development in a log. You'd want that employment specialist to review either electronically or in paper form. And then if they've had a Fidelity review already in the past months, you'd want to see their Fidelity action plan if they had it available. Hopefully they have it available.
I would say too, Paul, in talking about the kind of the documentation that would allow an agency to show us how much time they're spending out in the community, calendar, schedules, whatever it might be. I have yet to have an agency actually come up first try with the documentation that actually did that for us. That's the hardest thing for an agency to do. And I think for those of you that are going to be reviewers, you'll see it. For those of you who are just kind of learning more about IPS, keep that in mind that your supervisor needs to know how much time you're spending out in the community, and in order to do that, you got to have location and duration. And if you haven't got that in some way, shape, or form, it might be time to develop that kind of thing.
It's true. And in agencies that do it the best, they seem to have some combination of, this would be in states where you can bill fee for service for IPS services. There would be some combination of like a billing run for the employment specialists and their job development log. A big part of what they do is job development, which, depending on the state, isn't always billable. Now, in states where it is billable, a billing run really would show you all the job development that they've done for specific clients and everything they've done face-to-face with a client or, you know, collaboratively with a client, like over the phone. And you should be able to at least get a peek at on-site, off-site percentages that way. But Dawn's right. It is very hard to get it right on the money with that to show. And so there are a lot of neat ideas out there, you know, with like Google calendars or Outlook calendars that are shared calendars. Often those kind of electronic things can be reproduced real quickly for a big time frame, and so that can go a long way to helping identify the number. And then you'll see in the manual too, on that specific item, the manual actually talks about how in the interview, one of the things you can do with employment specialists is ask them about how much time would they say they spend out of the office in a percentage. And one of the things that's really worth doing is comparing what they tell you versus what you see either in the calendars or the notes. What happens is agencies feel like they're out of the office quite a bit, but the reality is not always that's not always the case. Especially in today's where you've got a lot of job applications being online. Often the most secure connection that we can offer to our clients is to come into the office and we'll do the application in our office. But we are always reminding employment specialists that there are many, many other places that offer computer, you know, for no cost, like libraries, where you can go apply for something in the community online and get credit for your community percentage. So it's continued work to think about it for sure, Dawn. You are right.
Paul, I will say too that Washington is luckily, and this is I think Melody and her team, Washington's one of those states where doing employer outreach on behalf of a specific individual, if it shows up in that person's service plan, treatment plan, program plan, recovery plan, whatever kind of plan you call it, if it shows up in the plan, it's documented in a note, it is something that's billable. So we're very, very fortunate. The folks that set things up were forward thinking with that.
Yeah, that's great. And I said last week, if you're an IPS provider and your employment specialists are doing job development and they're not thinking about the people on their caseload when they're doing job development, you really need to sit back down with your team and figure out why that is. If they have people on their caseload, it should be a slam dunk to go do job development in a very purposeful way with the client in mind. So that, based on what you just said, Dawn, could make it billable if all those other conditions are present. I'm always reminding people in a Fidelity review when we see that there's job development with no client indicated, you know, it's kind of like, well, tell me why that would be. You know, how did you decide on that employer? And almost always people say, well, I know that even if it's not on their caseload, they say, I know that, you know, this employment specialist on my team has someone they're working with that wants to be in custodial, and so I know they had this custodial position, so that's why I went. Well, that's on behalf of a consumer. You know, I just think it's important for people to be flexible and really understand the why of the work we're doing. Okay, moving forward, I know you all probably saw that big old slide that said time for a break, but you're not so lucky. We just took one. So we will get one in a little bit here. During the chart review section, you're going to look at a lot of documents, including progress notes and all these things listed here. One of the things that's really a difficult part with chart reviews, and I think I said this last week and I might have even said it today, is every organization really kind of defines their own form set. And so a career profile or a vocational profile or a vocational assessment, if you go to 6 agencies, you might see 6 different versions of that. And you really have to wade through all of the little check boxes and the narrative parts to figure out what does it have on it. Is it a comprehensive career profile? And the same with a lot of these other forms. It just starts to get pretty challenging because after 2 days you just get used to this agency's forms, and then 3 months later, let's say you're at another agency, it's going to take you a day and a half at least to get oriented to that agency's forms. And so it's a real challenge. I don't know if I can do this link. Maybe it'll let me. Let's see. So this is the link that we had included on this. So Dawn, do you want to talk a little bit about Washington State Pathways to Employment?
I surely can. Pathways to Employment is a site that our team worked on developing when we were still part of DSHS before we moved to the Healthcare Authority. It has, as you can see on the links on the left, a variety of amazing tools, including a benefits estimator. And I will say, just for kind of the benefit of the group, we have talked to Deborah Becker about our benefits estimator, asked if we run individuals through that in order to get an idea of what's going to happen to their benefits when they go to work. And then if we print it out and put it in their file, does that suffice as a piece of what we can score? And she said yes. So by all means, if you have individuals on your caseload that have not had formal benefits planning yet, do the benefits estimator, print it out, put it in the file, and it is an important piece of what you can put in there. But the reason that this website is located in the slide is if you look down at the bottom where it says supported employment, and we're to click on that link, all the different forms that that we're talking about now are actually, and am I lying? There we go, where it says provider tools up above, or IPS works, either way, yep, absolutely. So you can see career profile form and the tip sheet and disclosure worksheet and job descriptions and a participant log, which is also a job development log. And so you can see all the different kinds of things there, including the IPS Fidelity scales. So we put that link in there. So in the future, if you need to be able to access forms or tip sheets or things along that line, they're all there. I would also add the caveat that, we try and keep it as updated as possible. Every once in a while, IPS revises a form that perhaps we haven't caught. So your best bet is always to get on the ipsworks.org website and make sure that you've got the most current copy of a form if, in fact, you're going to use the form kind of verbatim the way they put it together. I've been in those buildings. It's just so much fun. So thank you, Paul, for showing those things. I'm glad that the link actually worked.
Yeah, last time I tried to click it, it didn't work, to be honest with you. So that's why I was struggling to orient myself to the website, to be honest with you. But it's cool. It's very comprehensive. A bunch of stuff there for sure. Even the building your programs. I love this document, building your program. If you're an IPS provider that's new and you want any tips on how to get it right out of the gates, that's a great document. And then, yeah, a whole host of documents. And we'll go through those too. We've got some coming up, I believe. Let's see here. So we talked about the career profile. So let me actually show you. I believe one of the emails you sent out, Dawn, had the career profile in it. I just have to find it.
Yep.
Yeah,
I believe so too.
Yep. And so this is, oh my goodness gracious. So this is a career profile where you can go in and you can enter your text in here, to make it user-friendly. Some organizations have electronic medical records. I've learned that if you wanted to have this document in that medical record, for example, you'd have to pay a sum of money to create it in the medical record. So for some agencies, it's easier for them to have something like this that they can fill out and then just kind of scan it into their record as opposed to having it be a document in their medical record. Every organization needs to make that decision, but that's what I mean when I say you're going to see different versions of the career profile at every Fidelity review you do, and you might even go to a Fidelity review at agency ABC, and what you'll see is they've switched career profiles during the year that you're reviewing, and so you might see, career profile version 1 in some charts and career profile version 2 in other charts. And so as a reviewer, you have to figure out where is the information that I need to see in order to give scores to people. And so as we cruise through this, hopefully most of you are familiar with career profile or what it is. The one thing I'll say about this, where a lot of agencies kind of miss, is it's not enough to just have a comprehensive career profile scanned into the record, for example, because the way the Fidelity scale describes the career profile is that it's done over 2 to 3 sessions. And so many places struggle because there's no evidence it's done over 2 to 3 sessions. They just have the career profile that's completed and then like a signature and a date. And so as a reviewer, without any other evidence, it's really difficult to assess how many sessions it took them to do that. The implication is there's one date, therefore it's one session. So what some agencies have become accustomed to doing is every time they update it, they will print it out and sign it again with a different date. So let's say they did it in late February of 2020. If somebody had a job start and it didn't work out and they decided they didn't want to be a dishwasher anymore, we would go back and we would print out the career profile and we would amend it basically and say, well, they didn't want to be a dishwasher anymore. Now they want to be a custodian. And then we would sign it at the bottom and put today's date on it so that when you go back and review it in a review, you see that Paul has touched it twice and it's updated over time. So every agency makes those little tiny decisions in their own way. One organization that was very confusing, when you went and looked at the career profile, it was in there and it was signed and it had one date. They kept saying it was done over 2 to 3 sessions, and it took us literally until day 2 to figure out that the only way we could evidence of that is to go through every contact note the employment specialist did and find out when they referenced the career profile amendments they were making. It was very tedious, but we found the evidence, and then, as you might imagine, our recommendation was you got to find a better way because we're not going to do this every year, where we look through it, for 2.5 hours.
I will say, there's lots of circumstances where you do have to look through every doggone contact note or progress note or whatever for a variety of things. I've seen some agencies start using a face sheet, and in an electronic record, I would think it would be a little tougher to do. I'm not sure. But so they would maybe have the category career profile, and then it would say dates updated. And when it's updated, they would add in a new date. So you can go back and check the progress note for that day and say, oh, yep, there it is. So that's something that I've seen some agencies do that I think is pretty handy.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And you might.
It's a very but it's pretty comprehensive. And again, like Dawn mentioned, IPS Works has got a whole host of things available on it. You've got the Pathways to Employment website. So jobs. So, somebody comes in, they have a career profile that says, yes, I'm interested in working, and here's how I'm interested in working, the different types of things. And ideally, people have it spelled out very nicely in their records what the job search plan will be. And what I like is who's responsible for it. It's easy for us to do things for others in the field we work in, but often that does not yield the same results. It's really empowering somebody to go do even a couple little things. So one of the things that comes to mind with that is, have a client get on the bus and go look for potential employers they would like to work at as they're going around their daily doings. So if they are on the bus, for example, or driving to the grocery store, their responsibility in the job search plan is pay attention to see if you see any now hiring signs or any employers that you think, for whatever reason, that looks like it'd be kind of a neat place to work. Help us help you is kind of how the team really puts those conversations. And so I think in this example, Kenya is the client and Marisol, is the employment specialist. So you can see they've done a really good job here of getting a list of businesses that Kenya's qualified for, and developing a resume and cover letter. So it really lays out step by step what we can expect from the job search. And then what I really like about it is not only the employment specialist is signing it, but the person seeking a job is also signing it. I think that's a really nice little step to take. Another job search plan that's out there and available is really you're looking at preferences. And when you look at the records, you will need to keep tabs on what the client said their preferences were, both in the career profile and in the job search plan. Because if you see that they're employed and they're not in a medical billing position, they're not in a small medical office, they're not full-time, they're not close to home, the obvious question from a reviewer perspective is, are we paying attention to the client preferences with this particular person? And if not, why not? And usually when you have to ask that question, what you find is the team just didn't go in and update the paperwork. There was something that happened or a conversation that happened wherein the team didn't update the paperwork to reflect what they're doing. And the most common occurrence is Callista comes in and says, these 1, 2, 3, 4 things are what I wanted to do, these are my preferences, but what's left out of here is, or whatever we can find quick because I really need money. And so you're doing a chart review and you see that Callista is employed at like Burger King, 10 hours a week, and it's a 25-minute drive, obviously not paying attention to preferences at all. So you bring this up in the interview with either Callista or the employment specialist for Callista. And often what you hear is, well, Callista really needed a job, and these are the things she wanted to do, but we found the Burger King job first. And so often the recommendation is, well, you have to go back and update these documents. Otherwise, it's difficult for us to give you full credit, with the Fidelity scale, because it looks like you're not paying attention to preferences. And that's just one example. But the hardest thing for the work we do, the hardest thing to get right every time is documentation, right? So IPS is no different than any other part of our industry. And this is good. I like this one because it asks, what will the job seeker do to find work outside of employments with the employment specialist? So that's a good thing to ask. It's probably not going to go really well if the only time the person is thinking about or looking for employment is when they're in front of the employment specialist. So it's not uncommon or unreasonable to ask that the client kind of meets you halfway to the degree that they're able, whatever that is. And in this one, I like the specificity where it says these are the specific businesses we will approach first or next or whatever. I think those are nice things to put in there. I think we have, no, we don't have another job search plan. We have a disclosure sheet, which is the next item on the on our slide. So plan for approaching employers. So if you're on this call, my guess is you're an IPS provider at some level. Either you've been doing it for a long time or you're starting to do it or starting to think about doing it. And so, disclosure is a big thing in IPS, and we want to make sure that there's repeated discussions about disclosure of a disability with potential employers. And as a reviewer, you look for either this sheet, which is a pros and cons sheet. And so it's just basically got a box where you help them figure out what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages. It's a really good, rich discussion to have with someone. But I think the other piece that really happens more frequently, this is often near the time of the career profile, right at the beginning. In general, what does the client think about possible advantages and disadvantages? But the more frequent documentation you'll find of disclosure is usually in progress notes or contact notes, where a client is talking about disclosure to a specific employer. That is the more frequent sort of documentation, and it's a very interesting thing to look at too, because clients will decide that they'll disclose to these 3 employers or potential employers, but they will not disclose to this potential employer. And so the discussion that the employment specialist is having with that client, the frequency and the regularity of that is very interesting to see as a reviewer. Some employment specialists have this pros and cons sheet, and then the next thing you'll see is maybe a release of information, and there's not much in the contact notes. So again, to me, that would be a recommendation I would make, that you could have more robust documentation of the disclosure discussion in progress notes, because a release of information just kind of tells you that you can disclose, not why the client thinks they should disclose, or what are the limitations, for example, of disclosure. So it's just, disclosure is something you should really pay attention to. It's really important as a reviewer to really understand how an agency has those disclosure discussions. This is the job support plan that I showed you earlier. So once somebody becomes employed, it really ends up being the plan for how they remain employed. And that's, as you can imagine, very important to understand how an agency reviews this. I will say not every agency is the best at having a specific job support plan in their documentation set. Some organizations, for example, combine forms like job search plans and job support plans, and those are all parts of your orientation to the agency's documentation, which is why I always tell people I would rather err on the side of caution with chart reviews, and I'd rather have way more time than I'm going to need, because sometimes you get into charts and it can just be really tricky to understand what's happening in those records. There are agencies, I know I've talked about, some have paper, some have electronic. There are agencies that have a hybrid, which is extremely tricky to sort out because they've got some, but not all of the employment paperwork in paper form, in the paper chart, but there are certain elements of the IPS documentation that end up in the electronic chart, and so it's important to figure out in those cases why this thing is in and not this other thing. It's important to figure out how they made those determinations. It's important to figure out, is there a plan to get these other paper documents into the medical record? And the reason is, if you think about, again, the principle of all of this, it's that the other non-employment clinicians can see what the employment team is doing. So if you've got 85% of your employment documentation outside of the record that all of the other employees are using, then they don't see it, they don't know it. And a lot of the other things you're doing, like integration, with the treatment teams, aren't as good as they could be if those other teams had access to some of those employment documentation. So it's really important to consider this from a real kind of multidimensional perspective when you're thinking about these documents.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I could add, Paul, is that on this job support plan, I know when I was in an agency and we had a Fidelity review done, we did them, but we waited until the person got the job. And one of the recommendations was do them right off the bat. When you think about it, how many times do we run into somebody that as they're doing job search, maybe they've lost their Social Security card, or they are going to need a food handler's card for the type of work they're interested in, or they don't have interview clothing, or. And those kinds of things could be included in this plan if it's done right at first, and then maybe redone when the person actually gets a specific job so they can talk about the specific supports needed at that point in time. So that was one of the recommendations I know when we had our Fidelity Reviewer, one of them, that was one of the recommendations that we got.
Yeah, that's a good tip, actually. That's a really good tip, because you're right. Often, because there's so many other things to think about, people save this until the job is offered or something, or accepted. That's a really good point. It's also good to identify who else can help with job supports, because it's not all on the employment specialist. It doesn't have to be all on the employment specialist. Anytime you can identify those natural supports, what that ends up doing is helps people become more independent, because there will be a day when they're not working with the employment specialist, right? They don't need that employment specialist, but they still will need those natural supports for sure. Let me see where my chart review form is. So we talked about chart review forms. So, and Dawn, these are FCS, right? These are Washington, you guys created these, right?
Yeah, Melody Pazold actually created it for the BEST grant when we had that, so back several years ago. And it relates very much to the IPS principles, because it has things like, what's your first contact date? What's the job development start date? So that as a reviewer, if an agency has this or something like it, you can go in and check dates and then go back and look at notes, and it makes it so much easier. Frankly, as a supervisor, it also makes life so much easier because you can look to see, are the staff that I'm supervising ending up, getting a person in and then getting them in front of an employer within that time, the 30-day timeline, or there's typically a separate tab if you look at the bottom where it ends up being, there's one that says job development. So
Sure.
It's a multi-tab form where you can also check the, gee, here's employment specialist Dawn, and look, she's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 employer contacts in this week. And so both as a supervisor or a reviewer, and frankly, a staff person in a program, it makes it so much easier if an agency has this or something like it.
Right. Yeah.
For this, when you're doing review.
No, it's funny. You're really hitting on something that I think I was going to underscore at some point, that it's not, the purpose of these things that people need to document for the Fidelity Review really aren't for the Fidelity Review. The reality is, documenting in the way that the Fidelity Manual requires agencies to, or requires agency to for the highest number of points, helps the supervisor and the team organize their work. And so that's really what it comes down to. These are great, and Dawn's already sent them out, so if you don't have them, make sure, please, let Dawn know in the chat bar or something like that, and we can get them to you. But these are very thorough, and as a reviewer walking in and seeing this would make you feel, I think, a lot better about all of the rest of the scores for the agency too. And you might not be surprised to know that agencies that are very well organized like this tend to have pretty good scores on the Fidelity scale. When you walk into an agency and you ask for a list of clients that have had a job start in the last 6 months, and they all look at each other like they don't know what you're asking for, that's when I start to worry. Because I really hate not being able to score somebody because there's no evidence. That just seems like not getting credit for a question just because there's no answer or because you left it blank. You know what I mean? So anything we can do to help agencies by providing things like this, and every Fidelity review I've ever been on, it's this really collaborative sort of back and forth. If you're there as a reviewer and they're really struggling with their job development logs or tracking, there's nothing wrong at all with sharing something like this and saying, here's something that could help. I can't tell you to use it, but you're more than welcome to use it. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and I've seen this in a couple different states, is when you go to an organization and they have something like this that is just really cool and really makes things slick, I ask, is this something you could share with me? And is it okay if I share it with other organizations who might be struggling in this specific area? And 9 times out of 10, the agency has no problem sharing it with me. It's not like it's a proprietary product or anything like that. It's usually just a spreadsheet or something like this that somebody's taken the time to whip together. Then, as a reviewer, what you can say is, you guys got a 2 on, job development. You seem to really be struggling there. We would recommend that you use some sort of tracking mechanism to really you put a circle around job development for your organization. And then what you could do is you could share with them, this is the example of something you could use. Now, this may not work for them, full disclosure. They have to choose what works for them. But this is a great start of how somebody else has laid it out in a way that could really be helpful for you at your next review. And most agencies are very appreciative, very thankful for that sharing of information. And when I don't have a document like this at my disposal that I can share, often what I'll do is I will ask, the agency that scored really well by creating this form, for example, would you mind if I shared your contact information with this other agency so you guys could trade notes on IPS employment? And again, the network of IPS providers is such a positive and collaborative network that I don't know that I've ever encountered somebody who just out of pure competitiveness has said, no, I'm not interested in sharing any of my secrets. Even agencies that are in the same city together seem to be getting along for the good of the people they both serve. So those are all things as reviewers I think you have the ability to not make people do, but just to put out there as an offer that these are things that can help. And again, if you remember that the principle of what we're all doing is we're going there for 2 days to try to understand how they're doing their work so that we can help them do it better. then those are all things that fall in line with exactly what we're trying to do. Let me look at, so here is, on the slide deck, we've got a bullet point for employment diversity form, and this really gets at job diversity and job type, diversity of job type. So we've got a version 1 of a placement log. Let me look at this one. So you've got employers' names, and if you remember from last week, one of the things that we evaluate is how many times are people going back to the same provider for positions. So this is one way you could have, as an agency, a really good reflection of that. Other people just have simply a typewritten list, and that's fine too. When you show up, you might have like a spreadsheet or just a typewritten list that they put together for the purposes of the Fidelity Review. If that's the case, questions I would have of the IPS supervisor are, how do they track it when we're not doing a Fidelity Review? If you put this together, just for the next 2 days, how do you know at any given time that you don't have, 7 people working at Menards or, Target? And so that's for them to answer. They may have a mechanism, but they just didn't show it, during the review. You've got job title here, so you can do diversity of job types maybe, and then rate of pay will show you if it's competitive or not, if it's minimum wage or higher. And same on this version 2, you have employer's name, job title, and rate of pay that can really help you identify that. So those are things you'll ask for either beforehand or to have present when you're there. And they'll be very helpful in scoring those job diversity items. Let's do this. I am going to pause for a minute.
Aaron had asked, can you show the previous image again, please? And I'm not sure which image that was. Aaron, can you clarify?
Oh, I just did.
You just did. Okay, good deal.
All right. Good question. So I'm going to take a minute. It's 12:55 my time. So we've been going about an hour. And I'm just going to stop for a minute and let's just collect some questions. If people have questions, I know we're showing a lot of stuff, so you're throwing a lot at you. So I just want to be respectful and just turn it out for questions over the next couple minutes.
Well, I will say too, from the standpoint of attendees in the state of Washington, because I know we have some from in Washington and some from outside of Washington on this call today. But in the state of Washington, the trainers are available to provide training to you. Obviously, right now it's only virtually. So if you want additional training for your staff on something related to IPS, we can do that kind of thing. I see a question from Dara, who I happen to know is not from Washington, but California, and I'm glad you're on today, Dara. Even those agencies that are from outside the state, we have periodically set up phone calls, sometimes with our manager team, with Melody and with Tisha, in order to answer questions about IPS and how we're implementing it in the state. So reach out if, when you're done at the end of the day, you feel like you have additional questions or need some additional training or for your staff or whatever it might be, please reach out. Paul, do you see Dara's question?
I do. It's a great question. I think our poor attendees are learning from me that I don't answer questions directly, but it's not because I don't want to. It's because it's hard to say. So your question is it common for IPS providers to not only use our participant log like this, as well as entering data into a required data management information system? And then she goes on to say, basically, I'm curious if there are requirements from IPS funders about using data platforms in addition to a tracking log like this, like MH data tracking or workforce/DVR data tracking. So that is a great question. And again, everybody who's been on the webinar last week and then this week probably knows I'm going to say it depends. So I guess here's what I'll say. IPS funders could mean so many things. It could mean Medicaid, state Medicaid. It could mean Department of Vocational Rehab. It could mean a grant funding stream. I mean, it could mean so many different things that I don't know that there's a best answer to your question. I can tell you what I've seen. So when we come in and we do a Fidelity Review, first of all, we're not reviewing, from a hypothetical perspective, we're not reviewing like the grant or the IPS funding stream. We're not reviewing from that perspective. We're reviewing from the perspective of how closely people align with the Fidelity scale. So there are no requirements from the IPS Fidelity scale for people to enter data into any system or any tracking system. These are, what we're showing you today are merely examples of ways that people document so that they can show they have fidelity to the model. There are, however, several and various versions of data management, data tracking that are required for funding sources that might make IPS opportunities available to providers. So I'm familiar with one in Kansas, for example, where, similar to Washington, statewide, IPS was a supported employment model that was going to be introduced and developed and cultivated, so they grew from 0 to several providers. And that project, as part of applying for that project and receiving the grant award, you had to document data in a statewide data tracking system. However, when we came in and did a fidelity review, we asked for no data from the statewide tracking system, because the statewide tracking system was a funding mechanism. It was a way to put a deliverable around a disbursement of payment. So while this is a great question, unfortunately, I think my answer is that it's probably common for IPS providers to have to report some data to funders, but from the purposes of an IPS fidelity review, there is no requirement. So it's a little bit of both, and I'm sorry if that's confusing. I'm happy to answer follow-up questions if that didn't quite get at the heart of what you're asking. But that's a great question, and it's confusing too, because in that Kansas example, when you would go down there as a fidelity reviewer, people would keep talking about the data tracking system during the fidelity review, but the data elements in the tracking system had really no connection to fidelity items. So, like, it didn't matter.
I think what we see in Washington, Paul, I was just going to say quickly so that it clarifies for the group of folks that are from Washington, there is an expectation by being part of an IPS provider, which now is being done through foundational community supports. It requires that you have service plans, progress notes, some sort of intake assessment kind of a thing. And so for Washington State specific, there have to be service plans and then progress notes that follow from them, because it's all Medicaid related. So the golden thread is a piece of things, but it's not a piece of IPS. So it's not something that we review for when we're in an agency. It's just something that we know that the agency will have to have progress notes, because that's part of our whole system. We do get questions about foundational community supports when we're doing reviews, and we'll typically let folks know that's not something we're going to answer now because it's not strictly IPS related, but we can do training at a later date, or do a question and answer related to that at a later date. So that's just the Washington specific piece.
That's good context,
Sorry.
Sean. It's important just to underscore that point too. As a fidelity reviewer, you're not there. There are states that have put what's the word? There are states that have tied funding and fidelity score, so that if you don't score a certain threshold of, you don't get a payment for your services, and those maybe are different conversations to have. And I'm thankful that it's not like that in Washington or the state I'm in. In the state I'm in, basically, you have to, as a provider, you have to have fidelity to the model to be considered an IPS provider, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So fidelity to the model means you have to at least score the lowest score for fidelity. Anything above that is fine. Allison followed up too with a question. Can you comment on the notion of job development and outreach in the future as we anticipate continued social distancing and various levels of safety to consider? Well, this is like the $1 million question, Allison. If I had like a piece of chocolate, I would give it to you. So there's a lot we don't know right now. In a lot of states, the very same places we would be doing job development in are closed down. They cannot open by proclamation of various governors across the land. So I think, I guess what I would say is this: from the notion of a Fidelity Review, from that perspective, there are many, many things from a Fidelity Review perspective that you can review and look at kind of pre-COVID-19 and get some semblance of a score out of that. Other things like job development, you know, I mean, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, I mean, really, all levels of the economy have really just hit the brakes and are, you know, stuck until some of these businesses reopen. And I think job development is an example of that, you know, agencies could probably do as much job development as possible right now with whatever is open and whatever and however what is open might match with the preferences of their clients.
Right.
So that might mean.
And I will.
Go ahead, Dawn.
Washington State specific, we have once a month a job developers community of practice call. This is not IPS. This is just support of anybody doing supported employment. The last call and the one coming up on the 14th, we discussed physical distancing and job development. How do you do that? There are agencies out there, a number of them, any number of them, that are actually still making job placements. And so we wanted to equip job developers with the tools to do everything they could in order to make that happen. So that's an arena. I can send out slides from the last one. I don't remember. I don't think the recording actually recorded the way that it should. Yet one more technical difficulty. But I can send out the slides to anybody that might want to see from the last job developers community of practice. And do please sign up for the one on May 14th because it will address that. Over and above that, for Fidelity Reviews, we discussed just exactly what Paul said. We're going to look at the, you know, more heavily at the prior to COVID-19, how were things looking, to get a more real sense of what's going on. But we also want to see some of what you're doing during COVID-19 to see if we can help you to figure out how to continue doing it. And like I say, there are agencies that are still making job placements. So it is a possibility, depending upon where you are in your agency policies. And I'll add that caveat, a lot of different things. But reach out and I'll share that information with whoever might want it. Along with the University of Washington and Rutgers University, we came up with a list of things you might do for job development during physical distancing. So let me know if you want to see it. I'll send that out.
That's great, Dawn. And as a footnote, I mean, there are still businesses open, and a lot of those businesses really need employees, I think one of the challenges that we have is right now with the CARES Act, there are people who are learning that it could be, if they qualify for all the levels of everything, it could be more advantageous to them financially to be on unemployment. So one of the things I know that I've just kind of heard in various conversations is that some previously active job seekers have found that they're okay right now financially by seeking unemployment if they were laid off or something like that. So that's something that is out there. I also have seen just anecdotally a lot of job placements in places that we thought were going to close, not closing. Maybe not necessarily retail, but certainly like we have a big meat packing plant here, and they have determined to stay open. One of our large employers in this area is John Deere, and you know they have not shut down the factory or any of the offices. They certainly do more video and that sort of thing to the degree that they can, but employment specialists, again, anecdotally, what I'm seeing and hearing is that, you know, if there's an employer that's still open and it matches the preference of somebody on their caseload, their first step is a phone call to try to see if they'll allow, you know, in-person visit. And if so, then they just maintain a safe distance, you know, whether that's from across the room or whatever, to have the same conversation they had before. So people are very creative, is what I'm learning during this time, and they're very committed to the work we're doing. So I think that is awesome that people would figure all of this out for sure. Are there other questions before? I want to take a quick break before we get through kind of the rest, because we have some videos, and I want to make sure we get to the videos and then talk about scoring and recommendations. So I'm going to give a couple more minutes here for questions.
And I see a couple of folks have written in they'd like to see the slides from the Job Developers Community Practice Call. When I send out, per the request I've gotten from a couple of folks, I think I'm just going to send out to the whole group, just so you have them at the top of your queue in your email. The forms that I sent out before, the Job Developers Community of Practice slides, and the list, and the link to the next one, which is on the 14th. So if anybody wants anything else included in that, thanks for attending email that I sent out. Do please let me know.
And it looks like Zoe mentioned that some employers are happy to schedule phone calls for job development. And she also decided that when she leaves her house just to meet her personal needs, she takes that opportunity to do job development as well. So that's certainly a unique approach, Zoe. I appreciate you sharing.
Nice.
Yeah. At this point, I'm going to take another quick break, couple minutes. I promise I won't get locked out of my office this time. We've got a few things to finish up, and then I'll show some of the videos which kind of show, they're from the IPS Works folks, and they kind of show how some of these interviews get done. And you'll see, I think, real quickly that the questions aren't, there's no mystery to the questions. They're just questions that help the reviewer kind of get to the answer. So let's do this. I've got 10 after. Let's be back at 15 after. And these are my keys right here. I'm taking them with me. I'll be back in about 5 minutes.
So how's everybody doing? Everybody doing okay? able to stick with us, and I know that it ends up being hard to sit and listen. And very honestly, I'm not sitting and listening. Knowing that we had to work from home, I purchased an inexpensive standing desk kind of thing, and I've been sort of dancing around and doing good. I'm good, yay. Cleaning out my fridge. All right, cool. Yeah, I've been standing and kind of dancing around, and my cat has now stolen my chair. One of my two cats has stolen my chair, so I'll have to rearrange her and my stuff to be able to sit again here at some point. But I know that in my case, it's helped to be up and about and moving. I see I'm not sitting and listening either. I've been in my kitchen since I don't have a standing desk. I'm enjoying the training and learning about IPS. Excellent. Glad to hear it, Angela. And Zoe, hopefully the things you're cleaning out of your fridge are science projects. Give you that sense of accomplishment, something that you did, multitasking while listening. Ah, it's looking brand new. Cool. Yeah, would you come and do my fridge next?
Hey, Dawn, it's Paul. I learned how to bake bread. That's one of the things I've been doing with my anxiety is now I have a sourdough starter. I have 2 sourdough starters. And then I've been baking bread, way more bread than a human needs, but that's okay.
Cool. Good for you. I don't know how to do that, so maybe you need to teach me.
I'll tell you, Zoe, you're right. Zoe put dough is the best therapy. You're absolutely right. And one of the things I learned is that the recipes on the King Arthur Flour website are very easy to follow for somebody who's not used to following recipes. I'm not very good at following recipes, or at least I used to not be. So that would be a good plug. Unpaid advertisement there.
Good to know.
I keep telling myself I'm going to learn how to sew, and then I could make masks, but I keep not learning how to sew.
Okay, so that's something I can teach you.
Okay, good to know.
You can teach me.
Yeah.
I'm a seamstress extraordinaire.
Okay, that's good to
and
know.
And I made masks that I kind of re-engineered the thing across the nose so that they have a piece of floral wire that's crimped so that it doesn't stick out, and I put it across the nose in a little channel. I can't think of the word right now, so that you can bend it around your nose and it stays put.
Wow. Zoe, I like your idea.
Making there. Oh.
Have a Zoom mask making.
And then
we have in our area we operate a peer drop-in center, like a peer wellness center, and it was very well attended pre-COVID. Probably 50 or more unique clients a day. And when COVID-19 hit, rather than close, the staff were very creative. They decided they'd use Zoom, and they would convert all of their groups and many of their individual sessions to Zoom that people could do on their phones or from their own computers at home. And so your comment, Zoe, about having a mask making Zoom meeting actually happened here. We had a bunch of if you've seen the masks you could make out of T-shirts with rubber bands, we had a couple groups on how to make masks out of T-shirts, cotton T-shirts. So people are really unique and creative, and this is the kind of time you find that out, right? It's really neat.
Absolutely. Yeah, cool. I like that.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip over to the slide deck. And so the group activity we did, face-to-face, we're going to skip, but I think it's okay. We've talked about, last week we went through the manual pretty explicitly, and we had some really good questions about the content there. And this format is not quite the same to be able to do this activity. So I think we're going to move into kind of the next phase of what we're talking about, but that's okay. So I'm going to see here if we can get this video queued up, Dawn. Wish me luck.
Looks like the link activated.
And you can see it?
Good job, Paul. Yes, indeed. Nicely done.
clients individually.
No. That's what I was afraid of. I'm worried about the audio. Are people able to hear it?
Yeah, it's got the feedback, so something's got to be muted. I don't know if the audio is coming through the computer. If you need to mute your phone, I don't know.
Let
But there's
me
feedback.
try to mute my phone. Can anybody hear that?
No. So I see lots of echo and no audio at all. Yeah, that's what I'm experiencing too.
This is the tricky part. It's too bad I couldn't join with my computer earlier without it sounding bad, because now that I'm connected via phone, the audio.
Can you mute your computer speakers and just let the audio? No, that's not going to work either. Dang it, dang it, dang it, dang it. All right, folks, give us ideas. What do you think? How can we make this work? There's got to be somebody out there techier than I am. I know Paul's a lot techier than I am. So if you've got an idea as far as how to make it work, I don't know if when we get feedback like that, it's because there's two set of speakers competing with each other. That part we know.
Right.
So then what about just having everyone go to the video on their own? Worth a shot? Do you want to give it a try? Can everybody do that?
Why don't I put the link in? I wonder if I can copy the link. I'll copy the link in the questions box. And so let's go do that. And that is it's an 11.5-minute video. And what I'll do is I'll mute so nobody hears all that echo, and I'll run it through too. And then I've got 20 after. I'll kind of come back out of that video probably around 10 minutes on the video, and we can just reconvene. So this is an on your honor, but please be on your honor and watch this client group video. I did see someone post something. If his phone is muted, he should make sure he's not double muted on GoToWebinar. Okay. So I'm not double muted. But my audio is from my phone. If I mute my phone, I don't think anybody can hear it. I did try that. Yep. And I'm not in Zoom. I'm in GoTo. Okay. So a couple of people have put they're already viewing the video that they got on pretty easily. So let's do that, and at about 30 after, we will reconnect. Okay, that was a little glitchy. Sorry about that. Not the smoothest video. So I did put on subtitles around the middle. So thank you for that tip. So I'll send out the links to these, and then I'll show them. And even though not everybody can hear them, I'll put the subtitles on in the future. So let me just start there, stop there, and then Zoe had typed in saying about this video, she's never gone to an interview with a client before. Is that typical? Saying she's talked with employers on behalf of clients before or after to advocate for reasonable accommodation, which is the most effective. So I don't know if there's one that's more effective than the other. It's really client-based. So I think if you're paying attention to the needs of your client, I think you're going to, by default, be doing the right thing. So, and remember, too, that these are, these interviews are kind of setups, you know, so I don't know if 100% of this is true that you're hearing. I like to think at least this one is, and maybe not the team interview that we'll see a little bit later, but this one's kind of neat. So what other things stuck out about this for you? I'm just kind of curious from the group. Okay, Rebecca's saying that everyone is different in what they want from their employment specialist. Yeah, this video did a really good job of showing how, even with just 3 different clients, how what they needed out of an employment specialist was entirely different for each of them and unique, and that is great. Yeah, it's a good one. Let's see here. I like the promise of confidentiality. Yeah, and you know, I'll even go a little bit further and say, Galen there in the greenish shirt, I think his intro really helped put everybody at ease. That was such a great way to introduce the purpose there and what they're trying to do, to try to join with them a little bit at the beginning of the interview. So yeah, the confidentiality in that intro in general. Aaron is saying the caseworker pushing him to get a janitorial job. That's a great catch, Aaron. My ears perked up at that as well. As a Fidelity reviewer, I'd want to ask some follow-up questions about that, because he's clearly saying he's not interested in a janitorial job, yet that's where it sounded like they were pushing him. So that's very interesting. And then Zoe is saying, I appreciate how the client stated to his employment specialist he didn't want to be a janitor, and they started again with client choice as the forefront. Yeah, he did kind of save it there. One of the things that sticks out to me about this is how the interviewers really do a good job of asking questions that they're also going to ask other people, like the IPS supervisor and the employment specialists, right? As a way to kind of get independent validation from multiple sources. So if they're hearing, if the interviewers are hearing from the team that, yes, we pay attention to all the preferences all the time, we don't ever do anything people don't want, but then they come into this interview and hear that, well, you know, Bob felt like, at least, whether or not it actually happened the way it sounded or not is, you know, whatever, but Bob at least felt like he was being directed towards a janitorial position. And yes, that was his case manager. And so, but you start to get into zero exclusion discussions if the case managers are pushing people to employment at the agency as opposed to employment in the community. So you could see where, depending on answers, other questions are out there queued up for an employment specialist or a case manager. The other thing is, I think the last question that was asked was really great, and I encourage you to use this with all your client interviews. What recommendations do you have for the agency? You know, if you start it with, we're here to help them get better, it's a natural last question to ask, are there recommendations for the agency on how they can get better, or things they could change to do better? I'm going to flip over here now. Are there things that like weren't asked, or follow-up questions you would want to ask? And while you're thinking about follow-up questions you might ask, I'm going to move through the Employment Fidelity Review Manual. So Angela put maybe questions about how the employment specialist helped them explore their interests. I think that's a great place to start. Gives you a peek into the career profile, right, and the job search plan. You know, this one's a tough one, the client interview. Allison is saying, I didn't hear any questions about how the jobs have impacted their stability or mental health, although it may not be appropriate in a group setting. All true. Sometimes you could ask, depending on the room, right, who's in the room and that sort of thing, you might be able to ask things like light duty versions of that question, Allison, like, do you feel like things are better since you've been employed? And kind of let them define what better looks like. That might be a way to kind of get at some of that information. A lot depends on who you've got in front of you, as you might imagine. Here's what I'm looking for. Where in this part right here in we certainly heard about disclosure, didn't we? So if you didn't have anything else to go off of but these interviews, and I know that's a setup of a question, this is one of those that is 5 items to get a score, to arrive at a score. Let me see if I can find, I don't think I have my Fidelity scale pulled up. That's okay. So did you feel like you would give them a point based on what you heard here? Employment specialists do not require all clients to disclose their psychiatric disability at the work site in order to receive services. Got 1 yes. How about they discuss with clients the possible costs and benefits or pros and cons in advance of the client's disclosing? Not enough info? Yeah, that's fair. I'm asking you some difficult questions to score this just on a short video that you probably couldn't hear for 8 minutes. Employment specialists discuss specific information, et cetera, or offer examples of what could be said. Yeah, that one's a little tough too, right? Employment specialists discuss disclosure on more than one occasion. It sounded like Bob, who was the most vocal, it sounded like he had some pretty robust discussions. It seemed like I'm maybe inferring a little bit. So to calculate the score, you know, if we had the Fidelity scale in front of us, we could use the anchors as appropriate. Let's see here.
One of the nice things about requesting that the files that we see include folks that were interviewed is we write down the stuff that they said when they were interviewed and then go back in the file and kind of double check it. So there's a check and balance there, which makes it pretty nice.
Exactly. So here's what we're going to do. We've got another video. Let me get this link sent out to you. So this is going to be, what am I doing? This is going to be a video for the IPS team meeting, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. We're probably going to go until about 7 minutes of this one, and I do have the subtitles on this one. So we'll watch about half of this one, and then I'll click back on and we'll kind of go through the same process. And remember, as Fidelity Reviewers, you'll be sitting in this room while the team is meeting. So you'll literally be watching this discussion occur. Okay, I'm actually going to kind of pause this here. So a couple things. As I mentioned, we're going to be in the room watching this IPS team meeting unfold. And as we're watching it, I'm starting to think that maybe all of you know exactly what a team meeting is like because you sit in them every day. I guess I just want to talk a little bit about this video as opposed to sitting and spending time watching it today. So a couple things. You're probably not going to ask questions during the IPS team meeting as a Fidelity reviewer. They're going to go about their business and do their team meeting like they usually do their team meeting. This one in particular is, I like that it starts with success stories. That seems to be how this group starts their meeting, and I think that's a great way to start a meeting. I think all of those tips and tricks that people use to make the work we do, more human, I think really make it better. And success stories are a big part of IPS, and so it's great to share those. This video seems to be really kind of broken into agenda items, again, which is great. If you are sitting in on a team meeting and they have an agenda that they can share with you, that's great. So the next slide that we have, actually, I don't know if it's entirely relevant here because you're not going to do any follow-up questions, and this is one where it's really difficult to score anything just based on the unit meeting. I guess you could, hypothetically speaking, say that since there's at least 2 employment specialists and a supervisor, you could score the vocational unit pretty reliably here. But this is most IPS team meetings you go to are probably going to look like and sound like a lot of other team meetings you have been to or have observed. So yeah, just really observation only at this point. You might, when before it starts or after it ends, you might ask clarifying questions like, how often do you guys meet? Do you always meet in this room? Is there ever a time when you meet and don't talk about clients, for example? Those are some things you might do, maybe not as follow-up, but as just clarifying questions.
We also ask of the supervisor, so not necessarily in the team meeting, as you say, you don't really ask questions then, but you start making some notes about questions you want to ask, and we'll ask the supervisor, does the DBHR representative attend the meeting at any time, or things along that line too.
I'm trying to find my, there we are. So the next video I'm going to send to you all should be a link for the interview with the IPS supervisor. So we will watch some of this. You can see there's music playing. I think we'll be able to get about 4 minutes out of this. I think we'll be able to get the gist of it. So here we go. Okay, I think we got an idea there. So what are thoughts on Galen's interview here with the IPS supervisor? I think he asked in several different ways about disclosure, didn't he? What are other things you noticed? Appropriate around zero exclusion, that was good. Wanted to know about referrals, right? Excellent. So you see how these are important for you to see, and I know we're not watching the whole video, we just don't have the time, unfortunately, today, but it's really important if you're going to be an interviewer, a Fidelity reviewer, go look at some of these videos, and Galen is a pro. He's been doing this for several years, and he is one of the pioneers of IPS-supported employment. The way he structures the interview gets him the information he needs, and he's really masterful at it. And so all of these are on the IPS Works website, and it's ipsworks.org. They've got training, well, I don't know if all of them are on there, actually. They're all on YouTube, and you've certainly got the link now. Watch them in their entirety. Just watch how the reviewer asks certain questions. Think about things like word choice and how they pose the question to kind of get the content of the answer they really want to hear, because that is kind of the trick. You know, some of these interviews, you might have 30 minutes to get as many of the answers out of the IPS supervisor as you can, and so it really, the more you do it, the more efficient you get at asking your questions in a way that it's structured to get you the answers you need in order to score. So it's really important for you to realize that. And then I'm going to skip. Let's see, we did the supervisor interview, right? Yeah. And then let's show you one on consensus scoring. So this is going to be how we're scoring at the end of a Fidelity review. This is a 7-minute video, and we're going to do, gosh, it's 1:53 already. Can you believe it? Let's start it at, we're going to start it at about just under 2 minutes. Well, we'll start it at 2 minutes. How about that? And then we're going to watch about to about 4 minutes. So we're going to watch about 2 minutes of this one and go.
Well, I will say at this point in time that GoToWebinar, I think, could bump us out.
Oh.
I think it gets a little bit of. It gets a little bit of.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Dawn.
Oh, it's okay. I'm sorry. I think it gives a little bit of grace past the end time, but not much. So if folks head off, you know, we'll just do what we can do up to that point in time and call it good.
Sure, that's fine. And so I think people saw enough of the consensus scoring, you know, to understand that the reviewers decide together on what the final score is. And I always try to push for 3 reviewers. That way you've got a tiebreaker. And again, it's not to try to penalize any organization or anything like that, but it's all about what's the highest score we can give them that we had evidence for. That's really what it comes down to. You may want to give them a higher score, but often the reality is you're kind of reading between the lines or inferring, and you might not have seen the actual evidence. So as Dawn indicated, and we talked about last week and we talked about this week, so you've done the Fidelity review. You're going to put together a Fidelity report, which is basically all of the reviewers' findings. And in that report, you're going to have recommendations. You're going to provide recognition and encouragement. You're going to show the evidence for your scores. You're going to make recommendations for any item scored lower than a 5. And you're not going to make recommendations that seem realistic or that seem unrealistic or anything like that. In fact, often your recommendations are going to mirror the language in the Fidelity scale. You're going to say that, you know, it's our recommendation that in order to do this, that they locate the IPS employment team's office to be proximal to the treatment team. And that's language right out of the Fidelity scale. And what happens is the agency has to figure out how to do it. You're not going to make recommendations that say, here's what you do. You knock Bob out of his office and you put the employment team in there, and then, you know, you got a better score next year. You're not going to give them recommendations like that. You're going to give them recommendations that are high level, realistic, achievable, and then they need to have some control over the recommendations. Certainly consult with your other reviewers for other recommendations or other ways to recommend it. And I can't underscore enough, Dawn knows I always talk about use the manual, use the Fidelity scale. That's what it's there for. I won't go through the recommendations of the Fidelity report or the action plan at this second, because I want to get to this slide. It's important when you go there. I think Galen did a great job in these videos being neutral, not really saying he's on one side or the other. He's super polite, right? Whoever's in front of him, he's got this very kind of conversational counselor tone, right? And it's also important if you hear something that you think is like maybe not a good thing, like you hear a therapist say something that you think is kind of a no exclusion sort of piece of information. It's important as a reviewer, don't react, don't say, oh my gosh, are you serious? Be professional, be discreet. It could be that somebody's just, they're nervous and they're saying something. You're going to verify it and corroborate it 100 different ways anyway. So just make a note. I always tell people they're welcome to look at my notes if they'd like. And nobody ever asks me to look at my notes, just to be real honest with you. So let me, now that I've done that, I want to make sure that I say to you all, if you have questions, please ask them now. While we're talking, I'm going to show, Tom's asking, can an example of a well-written Fidelity review be shared with this group? I thought I had one pulled up. Let me look. I don't have one pulled up.
I can. One in the manual. Is there, Paul? Isn't there a? Although I'm not positive in this one because I'm not as familiar with this fourth edition as I was with the third. But I think there's an example of a report and an action plan towards the end.
See here. Writing the report. Let's see if I have to go back to that one.
I think it's like, there we go, Fidelity Tools. Does it have a
sample IPS Fidelity report? So Tom, in answer to your question, so observed. Okay, so here's the sample Fidelity report. It's got some, formal correspondence at the top. And some of this top portion, the purpose through the method, might be very similar from agency to agency. Your purpose will always be the same. The agency part, the program description will be different, but the method might be very similar because the method is very similar, right? Some of the numbers may change, like you might not interview 2 vocational rehabilitation counselors. Then it goes into a summary where it talks about improvements made since the last review, for example, and it's got each Fidelity item broken out. So in zero exclusion, they made the following progress. In executive team support, IPS has become a part of agency quality assurance, and the executive director has enthusiasm about employment with all practitioners. And a couple other things that are identified as progress. And then there's certainly recommendations or areas for further improvement. And so those are the items that they identify here. I think this goes into the, so then your Fidelity report goes into item by item description of what you reviewed, what the rating was, the sources of information, and you don't have to put a comment for every single thing. I've worked with people who do it both ways, where they comment on everything, and then I've worked with other people that only put a comment on that are 4 or lower, with the idea that a 5 is, you're going to have like a strengths or positives at the beginning of your report anyway, so you wouldn't need to make a comment here. That's, your review team can kind of determine that in the absence of any specific guidance. So then it goes item by item through everything we talked about last week and a lot of the stuff we talked about this week. So here's the rationale for integration of rehab with mental health through team assignment. So one IPS specialist receives all referrals from first episode psychosis. Second one receives from all 5 case management teams. So she has 5 people from one team, 4 from another, 3 from a third, etc. Excuse me. So they break down the math of it. 52% of her caseload comes from 2 teams, and as you remember, to get a 5, you have to have 90% or higher come from at least 2 teams. So this explains the rationale of the 2, and it gives a recommendation. Assign each IPS specialist to 1 to 2 mental health treatments from which she will receive all of her referrals. And like I said, it's up to the agency to decide how to do that. You don't have to say, Karen needs to go with these 2 teams and Jane needs to go with these 2 teams. That's not up to us as reviewers. Each agency determines what they need, how they need to do the recommendation. See if I can get another one of the recommendation in there. So this is a long one, but for integration through frequent team member contact, that's a 3, and it's one of those where you check the boxes. Here's the 3 boxes they checked with their comments, and then their recommendation is they're referring, in a circular way back to the Fidelity scale, and they're reiterating, require the specialist to attend weekly meetings and relocate the offices so they can work near their mental health treatment team members, period. So this is in the Fidelity Manual. There's also, I believe there's a couple samples on the IPS Works website for folks that want to continue review some of those things, and that's in the library, the document library. And so let's see here. I'm not in this, I don't think. I thought I was. Anyway, got distracted for a second. There we are. I think it's on page 2. So there's a Fidelity action plan.
While you're looking for that real quickly, Paul, I'm going to say if anybody is interested in becoming a reviewer, let me know. If they're interested in having a review, let me know, although I think we might be full for the reviews we're going to do this year. And we can have additional conversations offline.
Okay, thanks,
Sorry about
Dawn.
that.
That's all right. And I know we're over time, so here's an IPS Fidelity report right on their website. So, and a couple other languages are available on the website as well, which can be helpful for folks. And at that point, I'm going to stop, and I will just I'll remain on a little bit. And if people have further questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if people have to go to other things, I understand that too. And just let me know if you have questions.
Oh, excuse me. I think too, one of the things that I've got is I can send them, if you're okay with that, Paul, your contact information. And so if they want to ask questions, they can send an email to you and me. So if there's a Washington component, I can add that piece.
That's I'm going to make that clarification that I'm not going to be able to answer anything Washington specific. So it's good to include you so you can help me out there.
You have done a marvelous job today, and I appreciate you a great deal in the training that you did. I think, and I'm seeing a lot of positive responses, even with the glitches that we had. I think, with the input from the group, we figured out how to make it through, and we made it work. So thank you all once again for your patience.
Well, thank you. I know this is not the way we had it planned, Dawn, but all things considered, it went off well. For a 2-parter, I think we managed to have a similar number of people, which is great. So I appreciate everybody out there sticking with us. And I'm learning how to do a training online just like you all are at the same time. So I appreciate everyone's flexibility. We're in wild times right now.
Amen to that. All right. So, and I do see a few folks that sound like they're interested in becoming reviewers or things along that line. Feel free to send me an email. Respond to the email that I send out when I send supporting documents.
Great.
Yeah. All right. And I keep waiting for the system to kick us out.
They've extended the grace period due to COVID or something.
Yeah, maybe it's being nice. And I see a number of folks leaving, so If you haven't had a question answered, please feel free to reach out in an email. I think maybe we'll go ahead and end the webinar if that's okay with you, Paul.
Totally fine. I appreciate everyone's time today. Stay safe out there, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thank you.